everyone, in this tutorial I'm going to show you how to draw a nuthatch in Graphite. Now this video is going to have lots of tips on how to achieve really fine, delicate details when working on a smaller scale. But before I start with the feathers, I always like to begin with the eye. Now here I'm just initially focusing on the size and shape of the eye, making sure to get that accurate before I jump into my darker pencils. Now usually I would recommend to leave the white of the paper showing if you do have a bright highlight in the eye, but here, because the eye was so small, I did accidentally cover more of that paper than I initially anticipated. Now as you saw here, I used a battery eraser to lift that graphite and it wasn't an issue at all. I've been able to remove some of that and I've got that highlight as bright as it needs to be. And this is something that's really important when working on smaller scales. Being able to focus more so on where those lights and darks are correctly positioned is going to help with more of that realistic look rather than trying to add in hundreds or thousands of individual details. So when I was working with that highlight on the top, I spent time to make sure that I'd got that in the right place, because again, this is something here that's going to draw that attention to the eye with that highlight being bright, but also at the top of that eye. If I was to have lowered that, it's going to change the expression and how that bird is looking. So it's something here when working on any size drawing that I want to make sure I get right. Now onto the feathers here, and again, this is where I want to be focusing on the lights and darks and achieving good contrast. Now this is the case with any portrait that I'm creating, but when working on a smaller scale where we may not have that space to add in loads of individual details, it's the contrast that's going to have more of an impact. So as I'm starting to work on this darker stripe around the eye here on the side of the face, I really want to be making sure that again, I'm building up my values in stages. I don't just jump into my darkest pencil first, and I am still following that feather direction. Now there are different ways here that the feathers are going to move, but as long as I've made sure that on this smaller scale, I've hinted at the main changes, that will then follow through for when that portrait is completed. Now what I mean by that is, for example, where the feathers curve over the eye socket, where we've got the sections underneath the throat that attach to the neck and the body, those areas there I really want to make sure that I've captured, even on these smaller size drawings. Now the entire paper size was only 5x7, so this little nuthatch is actually quite small. But despite that, as long as I make sure I focus on those main directional changes, I'm going to be able to still capture a very high level of realism when the contrast is also correct as well. Now this is why my base foundation for me is so important. I'm using a small paper blending stump here and my graphite powder to hint at those lights and darks. And you can already see here that I'm moving this applicator following the direction of those feathers. The way that they curve and change is going to really help here when I come back in with my graphite pencils. Now the base foundation using graphite powder I feel just makes the entire process less overwhelming. It can be quite daunting to work with white paper, so being able to have that graphite powder in first usually helps us to prevent that initial hesitation from occurring. Now something that's important to remember when using the graphite powder like this is we're not trying to get that base foundation as dark as what the finished drawing is going to be. This is where I want to reinforce that with my graphite pencils, which as you can see I'm starting now. And it might be here that I'm using maybe a 2H or a HB, but I want to be making sure that just as before I build up my layers in stages. If I do see a section of darker feathers, I will still use my HB, my 2B and so on before I progress up to my darkest pencils. Now as I start to work with the erasers here, it's the same technique that I use with my pencils. I'm still following the way that those feathers are changing direction. Now here I'm actually using a combination of erasers, predominantly the Tombow Mono Eraser, and then this here, that silver erasing shield, is what works really well, just using a little bit of tape over the top, and you can use that to lift off tiny areas of graphite. Now when working on a smaller scale like this, that erasing shield can be very beneficial because we can be very precise with where that highlight needs to be. Now I do of course cover all aspects of how to use the eraser, which erasers we should be using depending on what we're trying to achieve, and all aspects of pencil technique and of course how to layer that graphite are things that I do focus thoroughly in my real-time step-by-step lessons. If they are of interest, then I'll link all of the information to those in the description below. Now as I start working back with my pencils, here I will switch between my erasers and my graphite pencils depending on whether or not I feel that at that layer there should be some more of those highlights, and then come back in with my shadows. There really is no set rule with whether or not we should work dark to light or light to dark, so in some cases I like to do a mixture of both. And of course that is going to vary depending on what it is that we're drawing. But here, these feathers, it did have that combination of some lighter values in between those darker sections as well. So mixing between a highlight and adding your graphite pencils back over the top can add so much more depth to the piece. Now the other thing you'll notice is I like to work in smaller sections. So here I am just focusing on the face, and I'm getting a huge amount of realism here, despite the face of this bird only maybe being about an inch wide. So all of those hintings at those details, it still looks realistic despite me not having hundreds of pencil strokes. So again, this is something that I really wanted to focus this real-time lesson on, because working on a smaller scale like this, although it can be tricky, it can really encourage us to use more of that refined technique, which is really invaluable for our larger pieces as well. Now onto the base layer of the body, and it's going to be exactly the same process that I used on the face. There are sections here where the lighter areas are a little bit larger, so you can see that I'm allowing more of that white paper to show through. I'm not adding as much of the darker graphite powder in those areas. Now because the tiny little section of the wing there was quite complex in the markings, I have decided to leave that area completely free for now, and I will work on that once the body of the bird is finished. And again here, my base foundation is soft, it's fairly blended, there's no harsh start and stop points, and I have indicated at where those main lights and darks are. So when I start coming back in with my graphite pencils, I've already got that established and I can visualise that right away in my reference photo. Now when I work with my pencils here, again, I'm starting with something like a HB and then gradually progressing up in my values. I want to still be making sure that I'm following the light source. Now because this bird is perched on the side of a tree, I want to be making sure that if there is a shadow at any point underneath the body or at the side of the body, depending on if there is a one-sided light source, that I capture that. Now the one-sided light source usually makes for a really interesting drawing, so in most cases I will try to pick a reference photo that has that. But regardless of where a shadow is, like in this area here, I really want to make sure that I have captured that. What this will do is help to create more of that rounded shape of the body rather than it looking flat and a little bit squared off on the left-hand side. Now one big tip when working on a smaller scale, and this applies to any size drawing, but I think it's more of a tendency to occur with smaller pieces, is that we don't make our pencil strokes too long. I'm always focusing on the fur or feather length depending on the animal that I'm drawing. So here, if I was to make my pencil strokes longer, then I'm going to make this bird look fluffier. Now I do feel that working on a smaller scale like this, we might have a tendency to not shorten our pencil strokes enough to really work with the size of that animal on the paper that we're drawing. So here, although my pencil strokes aren't really short, I want to be making sure that I've got that natural variation, but that they're not too long. So when I'm looking at the entire reference photo here, I'm also looking at the face of the bird to make sure that that section of the feather is shorter than the feathers on the body. This again is going to help with more of that realistic look. The feathers directly under the eye are at the shortest, and then as we've got these feathers on the lower side of the body where it does get a little bit softer, they do have more of that longer length to it. So capturing that variety, the variation here is key. Now at this point I was really happy with that foundation. I've got those light and darks in place, and I did go in and soften those layers as well. This is a really good foundation then to work with those highlights. Now you can see here that when I used this Tombow mono eraser, I sort of felt like that those highlights were not showing up enough, not as much as I felt they should. So what I've done there, that's an indication that the layers underneath aren't dark enough. So I simply went back in with my mid-tone, sort of either a 2B or maybe even a 4B graphite pencil, just to darken those areas a little bit. So when I come back in with that Tombow mono eraser here, it just makes those highlights look that much brighter. Now when working on a smaller scale, getting that contrast right, just like what I mentioned at the beginning of this video, is going to have a massive impact. So if I don't feel like my highlights are bright enough, then that is something that I definitely want to change. So just spending those extra couple of minutes just coming in with those darker pencils and adding in a little bit more contrast can just make that artwork so much more realistic and help to take it to the next level. Now another aspect is if you do want your highlight to look brighter, but you've got the white of the paper showing, you know you physically can't get that any lighter, then that's an indication that what's next to it isn't dark enough. So for example, the feather of the highlighted section right under the eye where the feathers get a little bit longer as it curves over towards the top part of the neck. If I wanted that cluster of feathers to look lighter, then I need to darken the black stripe above it. By darkening that, it's automatically going to make that highlight there look brighter because that contrast is adjusted. Now with the delicate details on the wing, the structures of the wing here, we know there are individual feathers, but we can't possibly add all of them in because this area is tiny. Now if I'm working on this drawing with a much larger scale, then I would be able to hint at more of that detail. But just because it's a smaller size drawing, it doesn't mean that it can't look realistic. So what I'm doing here is I'm picking the main lights and darks. It might not be every feather, but I'm making sure to curve them correctly, and as you can see here, I've got enough in to make sure that it hints at that kind of pattern or texture that it is that I'm trying to recreate. Now this is a great example that in this area, if I were to add too many highlights and shadows, because I can see that there's more of those in that reference photo, for this size drawing it will actually go backwards and it will look worse. So I just want to make sure there that I do have that balance and that ratio just right. Now when working on hands or feet of any animal or person, drawing the toes and fingers can be really quite confusing, especially with birds here. The way that their toes are, the knuckles, the joints in the feet are tiny, so I can't possibly hint at that on this scale. But as you can see here, by again just picking out those main shapes, it's going to look realistic because I'm only focusing on the abstract shapes that I see. By the time it's finished, it will automatically look like the bird's foot. Whereas if I try to draw each toe and then force what I think that toe should look like, it's probably not going to look as realistic. Now a big tip here is you can actually turn it upside down so that your brain is then more forced to see it for the lights and the darks and the shapes rather than a bird's foot. And by the time you turn your drawing and your reference photo back up the right way, you'll find that it looks a lot more accurate. And again here, the way that the toes overlap, I want to be making sure that I take one toe at a time. If I try to block in the entire foot and then try to work out where everything should be from there, it can get very confusing really quickly. So breaking that up into even smaller sections, one toe at a time, even for a small drawing like this, can help actually make that drawing process that much easier. Now at this point I knew that I had the right amount of realism that I wanted for this size drawing, so those final little highlights and tiny adjustments that I'm making are what are going to finalise this before I move on to the tree. Now for the tree bark here, I'm actually going to make another video here on YouTube where I'm really just focusing on this one section. I can slow the footage down a little bit and then show more of that layering process. But I did want to include it just at the end of this video where I can add just a quick couple of tips. But I will have that video here just focusing on the bark portion coming up very soon. Now my first tip here with something like this is to again break it up into the shapes that you see and the main lights and darks. So regardless of what it is that I'm drawing, if it's something there that's going to be more complex, I will just focus on something that I see first in that reference photo. That could be a bright highlight, or it could be a really dark shadow. It might be a specific clump of fur, anything that draws your attention to that area. Now for me, with working on this, it was the really dark sections in between those sections of the textured bark. So being able to put those in, I could then clearly see where else everything needed to be. So when I then came back in with my paper blending stumps, and I did here at times use an eye makeup applicator, this is where I'm just filling in more of those blank spaces in between what I noticed first. And again, I'm now starting to then focus on smaller sections and then those main lights and darks. Now I think one of the easiest ways of getting more confused with a texture like this is because we sometimes seem to want to draw it all at the same time, whereas I like to break this up into more of those individual layers when I do start to feel more overwhelmed by a difficult texture. Now, I knew that this was going to be something that could potentially be really confusing, so I wanted to just focus on those lights and darks purely so that I could then break it up more easily into one layer at a time. It doesn't matter what it looks like at those early stages. It's meant to look terrible. It's how it's going to progress and then evolve as we build up those layers. Once I'd worked on this top section, I was then confident with how I needed to continue to layer to get that same realistic texture. And again, at times here, I'm now using a little bit of my putty eraser because that works really well for removing just subtle layers of graphite. So for more of those mid-tone highlights where it doesn't need to be really bright, the putty eraser, just dabbing lightly at that paper, can work really well. Now, using a combination of erasers here is going to help give us that variation in those highlights. Now, my Tombow Mono Eraser is one of my favourite erasers for working with highlights on fur, but in this section here I could potentially end up with too many highlights that are more of those straighter edges, which obviously with the texture that I'm trying to create here and a little bit more of that bumpier appearance, that may not be the eraser that's better suited. So instead, I'm going to first of all focus on the ranges of my graphite, so building up those mid-tones and darker values, and then coming in here with my battery eraser worked better with the technique that I was trying to use. Now, of course, you can use a Tombow Mono Eraser, but we need to be working with a lot more of those shorter movements with that in order to recreate something similar. But the battery eraser here, as you can see, it works really well. Now, the battery erasers are a little bit heavier to hold, so they do take a little bit more technique and more practice, but just like anything, the more that we use it, it does get easier. And as always, if you do have any questions about anything art related, anything that I've covered in these videos, then feel free to pop the questions in the comments and I'm more than happy to help if I can. So I do hope that this video has been useful. If it was, I'd be very grateful if you could give it a like and a thumbs up. It makes a huge difference to my channel. I also upload a couple of videos to YouTube every week, so if you would like to get notified of that content, then don't forget to hit the subscribe and the bell button. If you are interested in any of my step-by-step lessons, then I will link the information to those in the description below. I'm going to be uploading another video at the end of the week, but as always, thank you so much for watching.